All right, well, welcome to lesson 4, and we're glad that you're back with us. It's been a while since I've been able to create this next lesson. We've been very busy here at the Edgewood Church of Christ, but we're glad that we can do this. Hopefully, we haven't lost you with lesson number 3. But today, in lesson number 4, we're going to be talking about one particular manuscript copy of the Old Testament, and that is called the Masoretic text. And what's really interesting is for a long time, I heard about the Masoretic text. I heard stuff about the Masoretic. I didn't even know what it was, and maybe you're the same way. You're like, well, what is this Masoretic text? Well, we're going to try to explain a little bit to you. But these series of lessons about how we got the Old Testament are designed to give you not a full in-depth. I mean, you can go very much deeper than what we're going, but to give you a little bit more than just a surface level look at how we got the Old Testament. And so remember, I presented the scenario at the very beginning that we are in 1940s, and we want to make our own manuscript of the Old Testament. That means we want to make a copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew. And of course, in order to do that, you have to have manuscript copies. You have to have copies of the Old Testament that you could look at, you could compare, and then you can write down. Well, what we are finding is we talked about the scribes and the development of the scribe and how they were copying the Bible. We talked about the synagogue manuscripts, the synagogue scrolls. But as we sit here in 1940, metaphorically, symbolically, we don't really have any good manuscript evidence. The manuscript evidence we've looked at, and it's very partial. There's really hardly anything. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is in this lesson. So what we really have at our disposal at this point is, as far as what we've talked about, is we have what we would call translations or versions. We have the Septuagint. We have some other translations in other languages that will help us. But of course, when you're talking about making your own copy of the Bible, what you really desire is to have manuscript copies, copies in that language. And sitting here in 1940, we really don't have much other than these versions like the Septuagint and the Syriac and the Coptic and so forth. So now we are in our discussion of how we got the Old Testament. We are now moving into past the New Testament time. We're about 900 years past the New Testament time, and we're going to be talking about the Masoretic text. What is this all about? So, as we were talking about, who is it that made these ancient copies, these ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament? Well, that was the work of scribes, and we've talked about that in previous lessons. Well, the work of the scribe basically came to an end around the 6th century AD, and they were replaced by a group of scribes that came to be known as the Masoretes. The Masoretes became, or they were looked at as the guardians of the sacred text. And they did their work from AD 500 to AD 1000. So they have a span of 500 years where they're working on the Old Testament text, trying to make not only a manuscript copy, but trying to make those that would survive. But you notice we're getting further and further in time away from the Old Testament. And that's not beneficial, because the more time goes by where we can't have in existence a good Hebrew manuscript, the more time to get what? In the copies we do have changes and mistakes and what some people claim to be corruption and so forth. So the best thing would be to have a manuscript that would be close to the Old Testament times, close to the original writing of the Old Testament, but we're getting further and further away from that. So if you're wondering, the term Masoretic comes from the word Masora, and it simply means tradition. And it was used, again, of a group of scribes that were trying to keep the tradition of the Hebrew text alive and well. Now, another thing that we have to understand is that the Hebrew language now is a dead language. It's been replaced for the Jews by what's called Aramaic. And so that adds a new challenge. A challenge that these Masoretic scribes are going to try to meet. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So our modern day translations, what we've been using for years, basically are made from the Masoretic text. They come from these Hebrew copies that date from the time of the Masoretes. And so we're talking that our Old Testaments in English are all made from Hebrew manuscripts that were created by these Masoretes, get this, well after the time of the New Testament. So the Masoretic text comes to be created, developed, 5, 6, 7, even plus 100 years after the time of the New Testament. So the New Testament has been written and has been copied and has been circulated, and we don't have a good manuscript of the Hebrew text at that time. It's not until much later. And that's a challenge. That's significant. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. So as we enter the New Testament time, there are very few copies of the ancient Hebrew Bible that survive. And that's what we've been talking about. So why? Why do we have this big span of time where we know that there were manuscript copies of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament, but why didn't they survive? Why didn't we have them in existence? Well, here's a couple of reasons why. Now, this is coming from F.F. Bruce as he explains, the fact that there are no ancient Hebrew manuscripts is largely bound up with the almost superstitious veneration with which the rabbis regarded the actual copy of the Holy Scripture. Now, you might be like, what does that mean? Well, let me help you with that. Basically, what he's saying is that when a manuscript, right, Old Testament manuscript, became too old and worn to be useful in reading, they would reverently bury it, dispose of it. They believe this would be a more honorable way to deal with a disused text than keeping it around. I think maybe kind of parallel to that is the way people look at the American flag. Instead of keeping an old, torn up, stained American flag, we believe it's honorable to what? To go through a certain process to burn a flag and in that way to put it to rest. Well, kind of in that same manner, they felt it would be an honorable thing to basically bury these ancient texts. And of course, remember, this is not copies made on modern day paper material. These are made from papyrus and other types of material that a lot of these materials over time and through weather and so forth, they don't survive very well. I want to show you some pictures here of some of the process of these old Hebrew manuscripts. All right, so in a lot of these synagogues of the Jews, there was what was called a geniza. And what a geniza was is a storeroom in the synagogue for old scrolls. And they would be kept there until it was time to basically get rid of them, to bury them in an honorable way. And so these were storehouses of manuscripts. And you could see that, there's this little opening here that they're keeping these manuscripts until a certain time. Here's another picture of just a bunch of manuscripts, and you can see they're just scraps of material of different documents, some of them being biblical. I really like this picture. This guy looks like he just had it with these partial copies, these scraps. Here's another picture. And this is one we looked at before. Part of the surviving manuscript copies of the Hebrew are scraps that were found in the synagogue in Cairo. So they were not disposed of, and they just got kept there until they were discovered at a certain time. So that's one of the big reasons why we have this span where we don't have these Hebrew manuscripts. Here's another possible reason why. Well, another reason that led to the absence of Hebrew manuscripts was Jewish scholars would dispose of copies that contained and by their estimation, too many errors and variants, right? At a certain point, the scribe that copied this, there's just too many of them to continue using it. And so again, they would dispose of them. And so, in other words, there's evidence of a lot of these ancient manuscripts, good manuscripts, even some of these poor manuscripts, that they don't survive over time. They're disposed of either by man or by nature. So let's talk a little bit about, and I put this in quote, the official text of the Masoretes. So at some point in this span of time, 500 to 1000 AD, the Masoretes noticed variations among the existing manuscripts. And so they decide to produce what is going to become the official manuscript. A manuscript that all other copies are going to be used to make their copies, right? Instead of, some scribes using one or two or three Hebrew manuscripts and then other scribes using other ones, they decide we're going to make an official text. And this comes to be known as the Masoretic text. This is the one that all others are going to use. Again, trying to bring consistency to the copies of the Old Testament. So if you're reading some books and you see the designation MT, well, that just stands for what we're talking about here. It stands for the Masoretic text. And that's the text made by these Masoretes, these scribes. So remember, we talked about that Hebrew at this time it's a dead language. No one is using it. So the Masoretic scribes were not only concerned about getting the text copied right, but they're also concerned about the proper reading and pronunciation of it. Because again, they're the one reading this may not be, educated that well on Hebrew as far as the pronunciation, reading these things correctly. You'd be like, maybe you studied Spanish in high school, but in your 30s you're trying to read it, and maybe you're like, well, I don't remember how these words are pronounced. Maybe you can do well with some of them, but not others. Well, that's the idea here. Because what? Well, the Hebrew text, for most people in the ancient time, they're going to learn it by hearing it. By hearing it. And so it's going to be read to them, read in the synagogues. And so people are going to hear it. And so the Masoretes want to make sure that not only do we have a good copy of the words themselves, the text itself, but that it can be read properly and therefore pronounced properly to the hearer, that they understand what's being said. So in about AD 100, the Masoretic scribes develop a standard edition of the consonantal text of the Old Testament. Okay? Now let me explain what that means. This is a quote from F.F. Bruce to try to explain this a little bit. He writes, then, in order to safeguard the proper understanding and interpretation of this text, succeeding generations of editors affixed to it a large number of signs calculated to guide readers in the synagogues in the right enunciation, we would say pronunciation, of the sacred writings, punctuation marks, as well as vowel points, since Hebrew was no longer a living vernacular. So they start making little additions around the actual words, around the actual text itself, to help with the reading and pronunciation of this dead language as the ancient Hebrew is read. They also supplied a large body of notes to help, which were then placed in the margins of the manuscript copy. So with all of these additions, the scribes were careful, very careful, and this is a good point, very careful not to change or disturb the original consonantal text. I have trouble with that consonantal text. But that basically talking about the consonants that would be part of the text. So these additions were placed in the side column and sometimes within the consonants themselves. And so we're going to talk about the way ancient Hebrew was written, and then how it came to be written, again, to help the reading of the text. So what we're talking about, these changes that we're talking about, sometimes are referred to as the unpointed text. The original Hebrew Bible had no vowels, only consonants, and that's what I meant. They had consonants but no vowels. A's, E's, I's, O's, U's, right? And so, for example, not talking about the Masoretic text. Let's talk about the ancient Hebrew text. If you were writing in the ancient Hebrew text, David, or the word for the city Horeb, it would be written this way. All right? DVD, HRB. Why? Because they don't have the vowels. And so imagine Hebrew is a dead language, and you're trying to read this. Well, what word is it? And if you can come up with a word, are you going to be able to pronounce it correctly? And so this is why the Masoretes start making their changes. And so here are some of these changes. The reader would become learned in reading the text, supplying the vowels by their knowledge of the language. As the Hebrew began to pass away as a language, the scribes came up with a system of punctuation, the so-called vowel points, by which to represent the appropriate vowels. So again, now vowels are being added, or vowel points, to help the reader, because again, it's a dead language. So these points, these vowel points, often written above or below the consonants in such a way that the original text would not be touched. So it wasn't like they would write him through those spaces. And I'm going to show you some pictures of what we're talking about. So here we have David, and now we have the vowels put in there. And it makes it a lot more readable, easier to read and to pronounce and to understand what the text is saying. Now, of course, I've put this as an example in English, right? But what would it look like in Hebrew? Well, here's a picture of the Hebrew text, and you can see these vowel points that are put in there. Now, again, this wouldn't help me because I don't read Hebrew, but the ancient readers, this would help them in the pronunciation, in the reading of the text. Here's another example. And especially down here, you can see a lot of these vowel points. And remember, they read from right to left and not left to right like we do. Kind of looks like Braille to us, doesn't it? So why is this significant? Well, I want to map this out to show you this time span and why that our modern Bibles were basically built on this Masoretic text. So let me map this out and then I'll explain, right? So we've talked about the synagogue scrolls dating around 250 BC and then after that. But the problem is we don't have them in existence. Well, then what comes is the translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Septuagint, a version, not a manuscript, but a version. And that's written right about this time. Well, then we enter into AD 30, and what do we have? The start of the church. After that, at some point, now we're turning our attention to the New Testament. The writing of the New Testament, the copying of the New Testament, the circulating of the New Testament. That's not what we're talking about in this series. But all of that's taking place, and what happens? The Hebrew Bible is not being preserved. It's not surviving, at least. And then we get all the way down to AD 900, and what do we have? Well, now we have the Masoretic manuscripts, the Masoretic text. And of course, that's what we're going to use. So in 1940, do we have these manuscripts, these Masoretic manuscripts? We do. And so that's going to be our best manuscript evidence, along with the versions like the Septuagint, the Syriac, the Coptic, and those, and other Greek translations. But notice, we're using manuscripts that, what? are over 1,000 years removed from the synagogue scrolls, which are not in themselves even original. And so we have a large span between the ancient Hebrew Bible and even its copies to where we have in existence Hebrew manuscripts called the Masoretic text, the Masoretic manuscripts. And for a long time, critics of the Bible would criticize and tell us we can't trust our Old Testaments because they're based on the Masoretic text. They're based on manuscripts that were made long after the New Testament. A long span of time, over 1,000 years between the Masoretic manuscripts and, well, the scrolls that we don't have in existence. And that was a good point. I mean, we'd have to say, yeah, that's problematic for us in our faith. That doesn't mean we couldn't trust the Bible, but that was a really significant charge against it. But then something happened. One of the most significant things happened in the year 1947 that changed all of this. And that was the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, even though the Dead Sea Scrolls bridged the gap, and that's what they did, now we had ancient Hebrew manuscripts that were much earlier, before the New Testament time, around the time of the Septuagint. We didn't know these existed until they were found in 1947. And they gave us the ability to now look at the Masoretic manuscripts around 1000 AD, 900 AD, and these Dead Sea Scrolls that were around 100 to 200 BC, and compare them. And as they did that, they showed that the Masoretic text was a great text to use. That it kept the text alive, and we found very little difference between the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea text. And it just took away that whole bridging of the gap, this gap between the Masoretic text and the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. What a significant find that was. And we're going to, in lesson number 5, dedicate our whole lesson to the Dead Sea Scrolls and their significance. But let me say this before we close lesson number 4, that going back to our scenario, 1940, could we use the Dead Sea Scrolls to make our copy of the Old Testament, to make our manuscript? And the answer is no. You say, well, they were found in 1947. That's true. But they weren't available even to the experts, to the linguists, to biblical scholars in 1947. It would take time for them to be collected and cleaned and preserved and then, kept safely, and then to be studied and read, and a long time before they would be made available even to, again, the experts, the scholars, and even longer to where they would be made available to the public. And so what a great find the Dead Sea Scrolls were, that changed the whole picture of the Old Testament and its translation. Today we have these available, and we can use them in our creating our modern Old Testaments today. But in 1940, 1950, we did not. It took time. And so thank you for joining me in lesson number 4 as we talked about the Masoretic text. And again, in lesson 5, we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, if you're in the Lakeland or Polk County area, we'd love to have you come and to study with us or to be at our worship service. Our worship service is Sunday morning at 9:30. We start with worship, and then we have Bible class at 11 o'clock. And then also Wednesday night, we meet at 7 o'clock for Bible study. I'd love to have you there. You can check out our website, edgewoodcfc.com, and you can see our times of service. You can see our address. You can see our phone number. All of the social media information is there. Hope you'll join us for lesson number 5.